Let us start our discussion on a particular policy of Nazi Germany. This policy is the translation of the racialist ideology that was particular and unique to Nazism itself, and that is the policy of social Darwinism as applied by Hitler himself. Now, before we get into the origin and understanding of what social Darwinism itself is, let us first get an idea of what Hitler's racialist ideology was. Hitler believed that all races are not equal. In fact, there are some good races and there are some bad races. Now, Hitler considered the good races to be the desirable races and the bad races to be the undesirable races. And he also considered that the desirable or the good races are superior to the undesirable or the bad races. Now, who were the desirable races? The master race itself, which is the Nordic Aryan group. Now, in this particular picture, you can see a typical Nazi school where the young children are being taught about the desirable and the undesirable races, and also what the master race is. Now, as we discuss what the desirable races were, let's also see who were the undesirables. Now, generally the Africans, the Gypsies, and especially the Jews were viewed to be inferior to the master race, and also it was felt that they need to be urgently removed from mainstream German society, and that is the only possible way to get the glory of Germany back. Now, to propagate and to further this master race concept, Hitler took the use of scientific fact and scientific theories which he purposely misinterpreted. Now, he used the evolutionary ideas of Darwin. We have read about Darwin in biology, and we saw how his work regarding evolutionary biology has given us the concept of evolution of all living species and humans. So Hitler was going back to the ideas of Darwin and of course misinterpreting it for his own purposes. To this he also purposely added the survival of the fittest concept also given by Darwin. And all this was simply to justify the biological superiority of the Aryan master race over the other inferior races. Therefore, the Nordic Aryan master race was not just socially superior to the inferior race, he also used his scientific theories to prove that they were also biologically superior over the inferior races. Now, with time, among the inferior races came up Hitler's number one enemy of state. And can you guess who those enemies were? Those enemies, of course, were the Jews. And that is why Hitler's racialism, as we have discussed while understanding the anti-Semitic status of Germany, was also primarily anti-Semitic, or the fact that Hitler's racialism was targeted particularly towards the Jewish people. And that is why the Jews soon enough became the number one enemy of the Nazi state, and they were to be removed. Now that we have understood the very base of Hitler's racialist ideology, now let's see what the survival of the fittest theory and what social Darwinism itself was, to better understand how Hitler was able to translate these into state policies. Now, have you heard this phrase, the survival of the fittest, or only the fittest shall survive? This particular term, survival of the fittest, was coined by Charles Darwin himself, who we have mentioned was an evolutionary biologist who had primarily worked on the evolution of living beings. Now, in this particular concept which he coined, he said that only those living things can survive on earth who are fit, healthy, and can adapt themselves, or they can modify themselves over time to better adapt to the changing climatic conditions. And only those, therefore, who are fit enough, who are healthy enough, and who have the adaptability in them can survive in the harshest conditions, and every other particular species or any other living beings would otherwise perish. So who coined the term survival of the fittest? Was it James Watt? Was it Isaac Newton? Was it Charles Darwin? Or was it Benjamin Franklin? The correct answer is Charles Darwin. Now, the survival of the fittest concept is basically a concept which says that there's always a bigger fish in the water, which says that if you are a small fish and you don't swim fast enough and do not adapt yourself to the changing conditions, you would be consumed by the bigger fishes and you would no longer exist anymore. Now, this is the concept of there's always a bigger fish in the water. Now, Herbert Spencer, as you can see in the picture right here, he is the person who took this concept of survival of the fittest to another level altogether. You see, he applied this Darwinian evolution concept, which is primarily a biological concept, to humans, that too in a social context. So what is it that he said? So Herbert Spencer referred to the survival of the fittest theory and said that the strong will succeed and the weak shall perish. And this also applies to human beings living in society. Now, this particular concept, when applied to a primitive, animalistic and prehistoric society, refers to a strong man with the biggest spear being able to rule over the ones who do not have the strength or this weapon making capability. But when we're talking about society at its highest form in modern Europe, this of course refers to something else. As you can understand, people wearing suits and coats would not be fighting with each other with big sticks. That simply cannot happen. So who therefore is the strong person? Who will succeed and who will perish? Who is the strong and who is the weak in the modern societal context? This particular idea of the fittest was therefore applied to modern society, and the strength and fitness was applied to what the society values the highest, which is the wealth of resources and the power of politics. And therefore, who were the fittest? The people who held all the wealth, the capitalists, and also the people who held all the political power, or the politicians. And therefore the ones who held all the resources and all the political power, they were considered to be the fittest, and the other people who did not possess these were considered to be weaker and they were to be ruled upon. And this is the concept of social Darwinism as brought forward by Herbert Spencer, where he transformed the biological evolutionary model of Darwin and put it into a humanistic social context. So in a modern society, therefore, the person with the biggest stick doesn't win. The person who controls our resources, the person who has his own lands, and the person who can exploit the weak and the poor, they are the ones who have the true strength, the capitalists and the ones who have political power. But the Nazis even took this a step further. They misinterpreted the entire social Darwinism concept and also the concept of survival of the fittest, and they applied this not only to the strength of political power and resources, but also to racial identities. What the Nazis therefore said is that there are some races who are superior to the other races simply in terms of them having evolved more over the other races. Therefore, what the Nazis were doing were trying to scientifically prove that some races are superior to the others. Now, this of course does not really have scientific backing, as we can understand from now. That is because all races belong to the same species and all the races therefore evolved together. And therefore, even though the Nazis tried to put a scientific flavor to propagate and popularize and justify their theory of discrimination, in reality it does not have that much scientific backing. So while justifying the fact that there are some races that are superior, Hitler and the Nazis came up with the master race theory. The theory which said that the Nordic Aryan race is biologically superior over any other race which are inferior. The Nordic Aryans of Germany are the ones who possess the best physical features and also have the strength to adapt to changing climatic conditions. And therefore they are the ones who will survive in the longer run. And thus it is justified for them to rule over the inferior races such as the Gypsies, the Jews and the Africans. Now, as already mentioned, this really did not have that much scientific backing, but Hitler was able to have his own panel of scientists back him up on this, so he can further justify how scientifically accurate his social Darwinism and master race theories were. Now, just the superiority of the master race was not enough. It was also essential and crucial that the master race or the Aryans retain their purity. That can be only done if they reproduce with the people of their same race so that they can keep their bloodlines pure. And for that to happen, to retain the purity of the master race, the inferior races could not be allowed to interact and also settle down and reproduce with the master race. And that is why the inferior races had to be excluded from society. And how was this done? Well, the inferior races were separated from the main parts of the various German towns and they were put into ghettos. Now, what were the ghettos? The ghettos were those parts of the town in which the minority were forced to live because of economic, judicial, and legal reasons. And these parts of the town were often much separated from the main parts, and they were also restricted by building walls, as you can see over there, so that the Jews or the other inferior races could not come into contact with the master race or the superior races. Now, these ghettos also had the record low living conditions. Often these ghettos were impoverished and survival rates were very low. As you can see in this picture, how the society of a ghetto looks rather impoverished, and a person is lying down over here, fatigued from work and not having enough resources. Now, the Nazi party did not want to make the ghetto into a standalone unit. They wanted to make this a process, a method of social exclusion to keep the inferior races separate. And therefore, they passed the 1937 ghetto laws, which made this ghettoing as a process of social exclusion, which was applied to all German towns and cities. And eventually was also applied to all the other territories which the Nazis will come to annex and occupy, such as when Germany occupied Poland, they built about 270 ghettos